there were many churches that were receiving, bulletins that were posted on doors saying that, unless people converted to Islam, or paid what's kind of a security tax to the extremists, that they would come under attack. And extremists that have stepped into the picture and looked to radicalize say that, okay, well, the Christians that own this land, they are infidels. They have no right to the land. They need to be driven. They need to be forced out of this land or killed. Christians as a whole have a vulnerability. In many of these places, women and children have a double vulnerability.
Hello there. My name is Bill Bowkett. I'm Assistant News Editor at GB News, and this is GB News Originals. The number of Christians exposed to religious persecution worldwide has risen to a record 388 million. That is according to a damning new study by Open Doors, a non-denominational mission supporting believers around the world. Every year, Open Door publishes its World Watch List, an annual ranking of the 50 countries where Christians face the most significant mistreatment simply because they believe in God. To discuss this year's report in more detail, I'm delighted to be joined by Ryan Brown, the CEO of Open Doors. Ryan, welcome to GB News.
Thank you so much. It's truly a privilege to be here with you today.
Before we delve into this year's data, could you please tell us a little bit about the work Open Doors does, not just in the United States, but across the world?
Yeah, so we are a global ministry in scope. Our work started about 70 years ago with a gentleman that some may know as Brother Andrew. He, as a young man, began smuggling Bibles behind the Iron Curtain, and that gave birth to an organization that we're now working in over 80 countries around the world where Christians are most persecuted or discriminated against because of that faith in Jesus. We seek to come alongside with what we refer to as a presence ministry. We're not just, while we do provide research, while we do provide data, what gives that data teeth, if you will, what gives that data credibility is our on the ground presence with individuals seeking to come alongside and support them where they most need support.
What does that support look like?
That's a great question because persecution can take different shapes and forms in different parts of the globe. In some places, I think when many of us think of this idea of persecution, we think of some of those violent expressions. We think of people being killed for their faith. We think of churches being destroyed or Christian schools or Christian hospitals. In those cases, we are often able to come alongside with emergency relief or even ongoing trauma care and support for folks that have experienced things horrific that many of us can even dare to imagine what that must be like. In other places, that persecution can be much more subtle. That persecution can be Christians that have been denied access to employment, Christians that, children that have been denied access to education. So we come alongside with livelihood programs. We come alongside with educational programs, seeking to support Christians to allow them to stay rooted and to continue to be a presence in the communities where their faith, it comes under such opposition.
This year's World Watch List has reported a new record in discrimination and violence against Christians. Many of our viewers might wonder, what does religious persecution look like in practice, as well as the form it takes? Could you describe the forms of suffering that Christians are having to endure at this moment of time?
Yeah, there have been some macro trends that continue to emerge. One of those is a trend that has been getting a lot more attention lately, and that is the violence specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, more specifically in Nigeria, which in many cases can be seen as an epicenter of some of the violence that occurs. One of the things that I think is so interesting and distinct about Nigeria is the complexities of what is going on, because persecution never exists in a vacuum. As much as we might want to try to simplify things and look at them in terms of black and white, there are more often than not, a variety of different circumstances and factors that are weighing in. We certainly see that present in Nigeria. There have been some that have, in recent months have said that it's an oversimplification to say that Christian persecution is a dynamic that's occurring, that it's, the realities on the ground are multifaceted and nuanced. And we fully agree that those circumstances are multifaceted and nuanced. But we do believe it would be an oversimplification to say that Christian persecution is not one of the factors and the dynamics that is occurring there. Other trends, macro trends that we've seen that have occurred, there are persecution continues to get more advanced and more sophisticated in how the movements and actions of Christians are being tracked. I think that China represents a really kind of a poster child, if you will, if I can use that expression, of what that looks like as far as surveillance. I think that years ago, many people thought about the Christians being tracked as people in trench coats sitting in cars across the street watching people move from one building to the next. Now it's all about digital footprints, about tracking the movements, tracking the online, the digital expression of how people engage in their faith. And the Chinese government actually came out with a number of rules that more strictly limit how people of faith, how specifically Christians can engage in their faith in online forums. They've blocked and prohibited any type of faith content. They have blocked online materials that would be seen as attractional to youth. This is a country that it is already illegal for people under the age of 18 to attend Christian religious services. And so they've made great steps forward to try to control the online experience for those that seek to engage their faith. One of the big movers this year that has drawn a lot of attention was Syria on the World Watch list. It advanced up to number 6 on the list after being at, I believe it was spot 18 last year. After the Assad regime fell in 24 and HTS stepped into power, obviously there was a history there with HTS that had ties that many people were apprehensive. Many people were fearful, despite the proclamations of the leaders that they desired to see Syria be a religiously tolerant place where people of many faiths could come together. I think that there was initially some concern that gave way to cautious optimism that things could improve. What we've seen has occurred there has not necessarily been that marked increase, and there was a marked increase in violence. I think it grabbed headlines as far as a church bombing that occurred in June of last year, in which over 20 people were killed and 60 more seriously injured. But the realities of what we've seen in Syria have not necessarily been at the hands of the government. It has not been that the government that has been the perpetrator of these things, but rather it's been the weak rule of law. It's been the inability of the government to fully exert control over all areas of the country. And any type of transition like this, there are many extremists that love these vacuums, that love these vacuums of power, that love these opportunities to step in and try to exploit them to drive their own purposes. And we've seen that in Syria. We've seen that dramatically. There areas of the country that historically had been relatively safe harbors for Christians saw marked increases in persecution, that they were no longer the safe harbors that they had once been. Even areas like Damascus, populated centers, there were many churches that were receiving bulletins that were posted on doors saying that unless people converted to Islam or paid what's kind of a security tax to the extremists, that they would come under attack. And so these threats have been anything but veiled. They've been very outright and open about these threats. And so there are many of these types of vacuums of power that have occurred in recent years. And throughout sub-Saharan Africa, I think especially, we've seen a lot of there have been a number of constitutions that were suspended in recent years. There have been governments that have been overthrown, and all of these create instabilities. And again, those vacuums of power, there are extremists more than willing to step into those vacuums and exploit those for their purposes.
Using the internet without a VPN, a virtual private network, is a bit like taking to the road without car insurance. All it takes is one unlucky moment to cost you a lot of cash. This video's sponsor is Private Internet Access. They are the VPN to help keep you safe. Click the link in the description below to find out why over 30 million people have downloaded PIA to protect themselves online. A virtual private network is an app that hides your IP address and helps keep your data private. When you're browsing the internet at home, you give up a large amount of data to businesses, to shops, and indeed to social media giants too. Hackers have the ability to steal your personal data with ease, including sensitive information such as passwords, keystrokes, and even your personal photos. Private internet access helps protect your personal data by encrypting your internet connection to keep your data out of the hands of cyber criminals. And it's not just hackers either to be concerned about. Information can be censored too. When Canada passed their C-18 bill, social media giants decided to ban news content on their platforms. But PIA can protect your ability to consume the news and content you love. Private internet access is available for Windows users, Mac OS, Android, Linux, iOS, and you can use one PIA subscription to protect an unlimited amount of devices. And we've got a huge GB News discount for you too. Click the link in this video's description and you'll get a massive 83% off PIA. That's under £2 a month, the price of a coffee, and you'll get an extra 4 months completely free on top. Also, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee too. Visit piavpn.com/GB News to start protecting yourself digitally today.
North Korea, Somalia, and Yemen remain the most dangerous countries to which to follow Jesus. But I noticed that the number of countries with a level of anti-Christian persecution that could be described as extreme has risen from 13 to 15. What is driving this significant surge?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a driver in many places, that Islamic extremism. And again, in some places, it is a primary factor. In other places, it is an underlying. When you take a look in places like Nigeria, there are so many factors that come into play. Everything from climate change has impacted. There's been a lot of talk recent about some of the Fulani extremists, and just for those not familiar with some of the history there. So historically, in the Middle Belt region of Nigeria, an area that fairly heavily represented with both Christians and Muslims, and when I say Muslims, talking more moderate Muslims, and have coexisted peacefully for years and years and years. As climate change has started to impact, and traditionally Christians had lived as farmers in these areas and owned land and cultivated that land, and the Fulani Muslims had lived primarily as herders. I realize I'm painting with a bit of a broad brush there, but were nomadic herdsmen. As climate change has made some of the traditional grazing corridors less fruitful, made it more difficult for these pastoralists to continue to support their livestock, it's created great hardship on them. And again, extremists will often look to utilize hardships to radicalize individuals, vulnerable individuals. And we've certainly seen that in Nigeria, that as these pastoralists have experienced great hardship, there have been extremists that have stepped into the picture and looked to radicalize, say that, okay, well, the Christians that own this land, they are infidels. They have no right to the land. They need to be driven. They need to be forced out of this land or killed. And within that, there have been pockets of some of these Fulanis that have been radicalized and have become extremists in their views. And the extremists have utilized that to carry out an agenda by which they are attacking Christians. And so, again, it didn't necessarily start strictly as a religious issue, but it is one that is extremists that have been able to utilize other hardships, other factors at play to drive their radicalized agenda.
I also noticed in your research that 200 million persecuted Christians are women or girls, while 110 million are minors under the age of 15. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, it's and I think that's one of the things that is as we have come alongside. Specifically, I'll refer to some of the Nigerian believers right now. One of the things that is so difficult is that in all of these talks, so often it's their voices that are marginalized. As people debate and talk about, okay, well, what was the reason for this? Is it just extremism? They have completely marginalized the voices of those that have been directly impacted. I was with a pastor from Nigeria on October 3rd, or at the end of October, beginning of November, as President Trump declared that Nigeria would be a country of particular concern once again. And this is a pastor who, he says for the last 15 years, nearly 20 years, he's been trying to raise awareness around the world about what is happening, about the realities of Christian men and women there on the ground. And he said that by and large, the world was just turning a blind eye, was not aware. And so, he and so many of the other pastors that he works with and that we work with, we're so thankful that, that there is a collective attention that is being raised, that there's a collective attention that is, a collective awareness that is emerging. I think right now that their greatest fear is that this will come and go with news cycles, that the attention that is being paid today, that it will fall out of the news due to the latest celebrity gossip or things like that may look to take the place there in the news. But you are absolutely correct in what you were saying as far as the vulnerability of women and children in the midst of this. While Christians as a whole have a vulnerability, in many of these places, women and children have a double vulnerability. Again, as we talked about earlier, these things are never experienced in a vacuum. Christian persecution in some places, this persecution is occurring in places where women are already marginalized. In places like Afghanistan, where women are severely restricted, where have virtually no rights, and you add that dynamic and a Christian woman, the types of vulnerability that they experience, it just compounds exponentially. For security reasons, I won't even necessarily mention the specific country, but there's just generally referring in Central Asia. A young lady, and this is an area where for a woman to be recognized as a citizen, a male member of the family needs to stand up and vouch for them. A young lady that became a Christian, and her family was not happy about that. None of her family members were willing to stand up and vouch for her so that she could be a citizen and therefore have the rights of citizenship. Because of that, she had no legal recourse violent assaults that she was regularly being subjected to, because she was not seen as a citizen, because she was not seen as, in essence, a person, because no male family member would stand up and vouch for her. She had incredible vulnerability. There was no form of recourse, legal or otherwise, for her to seek safety from those that were looking to victimize her. And so, unfortunately, in these situations, women and children, again, often experience a double vulnerability.
Ryan, I feel like despite all of this, Christians being persecuted around the world rarely makes the headlines in the mainstream media. King Charles paid tribute to the plight of Christians facing persecution during his Advent service at Westminster Abbey, and GB News has sought to highlight this issue on our website and on air. Do you feel Western governments and news organisations are starting to take more notice of this issue?
That's a great question. I will say that, again, the believers that we work with are thankful for the rising attention that is starting to get. Again, the pastor that I was with, that, for over 15 years trying to raise awareness about this, about what's going on in Nigeria, and nobody willing to believe, nobody willing to listen. And so as heads of state, as political leaders, as even celebrities begin to raise attention and visibility, there is a thankfulness. There's a thankfulness that attention is being paid, that there's reality. I will say that, for many of them, that's also come with a pain, because as people have debated and tried to contradict the reality of their lived experience, that is painful. As it would be for the victim of any type of a crime, to have people that refuse to believe that the realities of what they've experienced, that is painful. And so, while there is a thankfulness on the rising tide of awareness, that's not without additional pains. That's not without additional complexities. I do believe that the realities on the ground in so many of these places, again, it would be so much easier if persecution wasn't a vacuum, if it was always so readily black and white as far as the realities, but it's layered into other political dynamics, into other social dynamics, into other economic dynamics. There are so many things that get layered into this, that it creates a complexity. And it is difficult at times for people to easily or quickly wrap their minds around the realities of what is happening. And so it's, unfortunately, I think historically, many in the media, because of that complexity, they've had to move on to other things. They've had to turn their attentions to things that can be more easily explained. Thankfully, again, there seems to be a shift that's occurring, where more and more people are being aware. It's so interesting as specifically again in Nigeria, as people were debating, and initially the Nigerian government was saying, well, no, there is no Christian persecution, and please remove this CPC designation to the U.S. State Department. The Christians on the ground, they were saying, if you don't believe it's happening, come, please come, please see, please prove us wrong. Please, put your boots on the ground here and come and, see what we see, and explain it away. We welcome that. We welcome the opportunity. And so, anything that can be done to increase that awareness, to increase, eventually that engagement on behalf of men and women that are experiencing, again, horrors in some cases that you or I have difficulty even trying to imagine. In other places, it is just so much more subtle. It is, we often refer to persecution and categorize it as a smash, some of those violent expressions, but there's also a squeeze of persecution. When Christians in a community, have their water turned off at their residence, when they have their electricity turned off because of, those in the community are opposed to their faith. Those are the types of things that just make life difficult. And the goal of those applying those pressures is to get those Christians either to walk away from their faith or to leave those communities. And that's not right. That's not okay. And so, all of these things that are raising awareness, they are good and they are a first step. But as our brothers and sisters have, on the ground have said, that's a first step. That's not enough. If we collectively become aware, but then do nothing, then what has that awareness been for? What has it accomplished? Sympathy is not all that's needed. Engagement is needed.
While Christians in the UK are not experiencing the systemic state-sanctioned persecution seen in other parts of the world, some observers would argue that believers here in Britain are facing increasingly social, legal, workplace discrimination, whether it's aggression towards street preachers or people being arrested for silent prayer outside abortion clinics. Do these developments concern you?
Absolutely, it does concern, and there are realities I think in many Western countries where those realities. There is also a dynamic, and it's being widely reported of growth in the church in the UK as well, and different movements, and some saying, especially with young men and things, turning to faith, and we're seeing similar types of dynamics in many places around the globe that traditionally have had freedom of religion, but yet the Christian church has been in a state of decline in those places. But these dynamics coming in play where many Christians in free areas of the world are feeling more and more that the broader culture is at odds with their faith, with principles or tenets of their faith, and rightfully or accurately so, experiencing more and more hostilities in that lived expression of their faith. It's those each and every one of those things are difficult. Each and every one of those things are sad and hard. I would never look to trivialize those, but by means of comparison, we do live in places where there is an effective rule of law, and in many cases we still do have avenues by which our rights can be upheld. I know at times it can feel on any given day that those rights are being diminished. Those rights are under attack, but we still have those rights. There are places in around the globe, by means of comparison, where those rights are non-existent. Those rights, there's not even a pretense. There's some places where that they have laws on the books that would seem to uphold religious liberties, but they are in no way observed. There are contradictory laws that are applied or twisted to create hardships. But there are places in this world where there's no pretense. Places like North Korea on the list. Places like Eritrea. There are hardships that are, it's not comparable. What I encourage all of us, who live in free context, as we experience those types of hostilities and perhaps feel the increase of those, that to the degree that it allows us a greater empathy and an understanding, to what some of our brothers and sisters are experiencing. Um, there's a redemptive value that can come from those experiences. And again, I think it's important that we do stand up and utilize the rule of law. I would never encourage Christians to try to weaponize those things, but I do think that by means of comparison, we've got brothers and sisters around the globe that again, if our experiences can help us better empathize and understand those, then great. But by means of comparison, what you or I might experience pales in comparison to what so many around the globe are experiencing.
And Ryan, I feel like I should end on a more positive note, and that is during the Angelus address at the Jubilee of Paul, Pope Leo reflected on the persecution of Christians, saying they are witnesses of truth. Amidst the unprecedented levels of oppression and harassment and mistreatment, there are inspiring stories of brave faith from persecuted Christians around the world. What tales have you heard of resilience and of hope?
Yeah, ultimately, if we end the story just at the hardships or the tragedies, I think we're missing the larger story here. Because ultimately, for the church, this is a story of hope. As horrific and as awful as these individual circumstances are, the reality that the reason the church is coming under opposition is because the church is growing, is because the church is not dying. We could end persecution tomorrow if the Christian church were just to lay down and say we give up. But that's not the case. It's so many places. When you take a look at where the church is most growing globally and overlay, our Open Doors World Watch List map of persecution, you see a lot of overlap. The church is coming under persecution in areas where the church is growing and advancing and refusing to lay down and die. A little over a year ago, had the privilege to meet with a Sudanese believer. And, he was a gentleman. He had been of a Muslim background faith. He had converted to Christianity, and in so many places that right to conversion is what is non-existent. And for folks that choose to follow a Christian faith, they come under extreme pressure, sometimes legally, but certainly socially within their communities and even their own families. And that was the case with this gentleman. He was basically rejected by his community. His family disowned him. And as he sought to share his faith with his neighbors, he was imprisoned. And I asked him about that experience because, Jesus in the Gospels and in a section of scripture known as the Sermon on the Mount, he said, "Blessed are the persecuted." And that's, as I hear about these experiences, as I hear about imprisonments, blessed isn't the first word that tends to come to mind for me. And so I asked him about that. And he said, well, he wouldn't choose the experience. He said he was thankful for it because he said in terms of his faith, he said, I went into prison as a kitten, but I came out as a lion. He said, I experienced realities of the presence of Jesus in ways that I had never experienced before. He said that his faith, it took on feet, it took on hands, it became something that was living for him in ways that it had not been before. And keep in mind, this was a gentleman that was already willing to go to prison for his faith, but yet, that faith deepened from that experience. And that's a common story of so many of those around the globe who experience persecution, while those that are enacting persecution may be looking and hoping that it would break the back of the church, that it would break the back through fear and intimidation. And that does happen in some places. There are places where people are broken and do walk away from their faith. But there are also those stories, and we see so many of these where the back is not breaking; it's being strengthened. The church is growing, and it amazes me as we come alongside the church, and again, we come alongside in a lot of practical ways. Offering trauma support, discipleship, emergency relief, education, livelihood, all of these types of things. But by and large, the thing that those that we work with, that they're most asking for aren't those material resources, but they're asking for prayer. They're asking for their brothers and sisters around the globe not to forget them. They're in most cases, they're not asking for their persecution to end. What they're asking for is that we not leave them alone in their persecution. In so many of these places, they recognize that the Bible even says that persecution can and will come, and so they're not fearful of that. They're not fearful of the persecution. They just want to know that they're not alone. They want to know that they have a family of fellow Christians around the globe that are standing with them.
Ryan Brown of Open Doors, thank you so much for speaking to me. And of course, we continue to pray for all persecuted Christians across the globe. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the GB News YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.